So without plants, we are nothing. So this is a reminder that all our life on this planet comes from plants. And as part of the Native Plant Society, again, it's part of our focus, obviously. So I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. So I started my official career in 1978 on a fuels management crew with then CDF, California Department of Forestry. And I retired in 2016 as a CalFire Battalion Chief in the Colfax Alpha Battalion. I now serve as the project manager for the North Fork American River Shaded Fuel Break. So I have over 4 decades of experience in wildland firefighting, fire behavior, in fuels management. Most all that was spent on the Sierra Nevada mountain range or the Cascade mountain ranges up north of here. So, and during my time, it was operation, which meant I used to have thousands of hours on the fire control lines. So think about this. In our declaration of war on fire, we unintentionally declared war on our environment. We have basically declared war on ourselves. Think about this. We are losing the war on fire. Our home, our business, our infrastructure, and lifestyle all live in a fire-adapted environment. We have no way to alter the fact that natural vegetation is and once burned, much of it wants and needs fire. Our losses are horrific. In the Camp Fire in 2018, when it burned through the town of Paradise, 85 people were killed. Nearly 14,000 resident structures were destroyed, 530 commercial structures destroyed, and nearly 4,300 outbuildings along with 153,000 other acres burned, $16.5 billion damaged. So we must stay engaged in the fight, but we have to think about altering our strategy. Let's have a closer look at the war we are losing while we are winning every battle. Unfortunately, we have death and injury to both civilians and first responders. We have mass evacuations now, mental illness and injuries to both civilians and first responders, billions of dollars in suppression costs, billions of dollars in property losses, destroyed and damaged infrastructure, insurance costs significantly increasing and/or cancellations, real estate values decreasing, reduction of government revenues, destroyed and damaged ecological infrastructure in the forms of clean air and water, soils, carbon sequestration, plant diversity, and of course, overall biodiversity. As the fire intensity escalates, we in turn escalate our war machine, more and bigger aircraft, fire engines, bulldozers, fire crews, etc. So, for example, in this photo here, this is Lake Tahoe as the King Fire approaches it as it's initiated out of El Dorado County there. Our war is neither with fire nor with the fuels, but with our ignorance and our arrogance. We are, in fact, losing to ourselves. We only have 2 choices, to both burn and interact, and that is visual mechanical stewardship with the native vegetation, or suffer through unending war on fire. Where ultimately, we will win every battle, but again, sustain unacceptable losses. Think about this. We must begin to invest in our ecological infrastructure. 2 choices. This kind of fire on the left, which is extreme fire behavior, or you'll have a term called severe fire, or the choice on the right, which is a low-intensity fire, which is a man's fire. Think about this for a second here also. In California, smoke-free air is an unobtainable and unsustainable luxury in fire-adaptive ecosystems. Again, we only have 2 choices. We can tolerate natural man smoke from control burns or suffer through life-threatening, intolerable smokes, much of which has has carcinogenic properties due to the anthropogenic fuel loading. In other words, it burns through the homes and the junk and sort of man-made items out there. Again, 2 smoke choices: either mass release of carbon into the atmosphere along with massive amounts of pollution, or much more lighter smoke in photo right of a light control burn. Why only 2 choices? Because we cannot eliminate or alter the natural vegetation. The traits of being fire adaptive dependent, these traits want and need to spread fire. We cannot eliminate native vegetation that literally gives us life. And with a population of 40 million people in California, you consider mental illness, drug addiction, ignorance, carelessness, accidental fire starts, and in the end, lightning. Ignition is inevitable. And even if we can eliminate it to virtually 0 ignitions, when you lose your home, a loved one, your business, that's the worst fire season ever. Again, we got to remember, we're always in this prison of 2 choices, unfortunately. One of the things that we're seeing out there, again, I just got a short pause here, is the vilification of our native plants. So one of the things that I find quite frustrating is what we see within the political or within our social medias or within the media itself is blaming our native vegetation for our structural losses or loss of infrastructure. So vilifying our native plant communities for our fire losses, I say, is resulting is in misinformation and incredible losses to harm to our ecosystem. It makes as much sense as vilifying the summer months of blaming the sun for our losses. Exploiting the fire threat is resulting in draconian action from homeowners to a misinformed public, and that places great pressure on the agencies to do something. So again, this vilification of our native plant communities is mainly born out of ignorance of what is going on out there. So hopefully we can start making that course correction. So this leads us to the purpose of what this presentation is. I refer to it as holistic fuels management, or you'll hear the term ecological forestry. So when we look at holistic fuels management, we're looking at the entirety of the plant community and down to the individual specimens on that particular site. And for example, in the photo that's now populated, you see what is a site that is maintained by low intensity fire. This is Mount Howe in Placer County. And this is an oak woodland conifer forest structure. It has a natural fire occurring in it, and it's open and park-like. So we consider every plant here and how it plays its role in the natural environment. So if we look at holistic fuels management or ecological forestry, there are multiple things we have to understand about where we are today. So we have to understand the problem and understand where we once were in our native plants on the west slope of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, how we got here, then accepting our natural reality of our native vegetation, and then understand it's a fuels problem and not a climate change problem. And I will explain that thoroughly. And then we have to look at human interaction and stewardship. And then we look at what fuel management provides. It provides a fuel break. And when we talk about fuel breaks, we actually talk about slowing down fire, not allowing fire to occur. I want to go back to the one issue that says it is a fuels problem, not a climate change problem. There's a lot out there in the form of the new normal, or that climate change is being overly blamed for things that are not directly related to climate change. And we'll explore that a little more thoroughly here. So consider this: California Indian villages were constructed from trees, barks, and grasses. California Indians did not have fire departments, early detection systems, fire safe council, fire-wise communities. They occupied the same ground we occupy today. They did not live in fear of fires or fire seasons. They lived in the cultural or historical forestry calm and environments. So again, how could a culture society live in the exact same vegetation type that we live in today, yet did not suffer the losses that we now suffer today? So the indigenous people, what Dr. Bonison points out, they managed the state to what we call a desired state. So I refer to it as the desired state of California, honoring the first people. So the indigenous populations managed the resources to a desired state. This was heavily chronicled from explorers to missionaries to the pioneers. They describe it as a place of incredible gardens, abundant fish and wildlife, and our research allows us to make that necessary connection to management. So the west slope of the Sierra Nevada mountain range was heavily managed by humans and has been going back over 10,000 years, or many, many thousand years in sites. And this management maintained the forest in what we call a subclimax successional state. In other words, they managed the forest and the plant community in a way that gave them the greatest advantage to maintain their cultures and their societies. They accomplished through interaction in plant communities. They were knowledge. As they applied knowledge, they were active. They were not passive. They were brilliant and elegant environments they created. You look at the Amamustan approach to fire, the tribal band, the Amamustans. They said fire was given to them by the Creator for stewardship of the land. We look at fire as an enemy to be fought and engaged. And in the process, we try to eradicate plant communities and do, again, what I refer to as draconian actions. So again, they saw fire as a stewardship tool. We see fire as something to be feared and combated. One moment, please. So the cultural or historical force that once occupied this landscape, and again, the photo here shows what this forest once looked like. What was unique about that historical and cultural force was it was fire resilient. Fire could pass through it, and the plant community suffered minor losses. It was fire adaptive. It adapted to the presence of fire. It was climate change resilient. It was climate event adaptive and resilient. It was rich in plant diversity. It was rich in biodiversity because of the plant diversity. It produced more, or actually used or consumed less water. It burned with low intensity with isolated exceptions, and sequestered or captured great amounts of carbon. So this historical cultural force is what once occupied many parts of California, but specifically the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So if we want to begin to understand what's happening, we need to start understanding what drives extreme fire behavior or fire severity, or what we call severe fire. So extreme fire behavior has been a problem that's centuries in the making. When I say it's the fuels, not the climate, or not climate change, recognize climate change is a significant problem. But time is given too much emphasis, and it gets solely blamed for our destructive fires. So if we want to really break climate change from the fuels, we have to understand the problem and how we actually got to where we got here. Okay, so for us to go forward, we got to look backwards. And what we got to understand is the degradation of the native plants and the environment and how we got here. So let's have a look backwards so we can go forwards. If you consider this, the degradation that has led to extreme fire behavior, we want to look at this historical element. So California's biodiversity has been degraded over the past centuries. Brief introduction to the most significant events occurred, and a great read on this is by Dr. Kat Anderson in Tending the Wild, and that's where most of this information comes from. So we just look at the Spanish mission period, impact on the native peoples. As the European contact begins in California, the goal is to civilize the native people. And in this process, in 1773, controlled grazing begins in California. So the introduction of both, if you will, foreign animals and non-indigenous plants occur. The indigenous populations now are moved into forced labor, and this begins to change their cultural practices. As a great example, in 1797, the first fire control law banning cultural burning was passed. So think about this. As a state, we've been trying to legislate fire and the prevention of fire and the control of fire for nearly 223 years. And then in this process of changing cultural practices, we begin to introduce the introduction of non-native plants, and then the introduction of disease enters the native people. Between the forced removal and genocide of the indigenous populations, both intentional and unintentional, the processes begin to remove the human interactive component. Remember, the indigenous people were quite interactive in their native plant communities. Fire was one of the principal tools for managing that plant community. But with the civilization and the change of cultural practices and introduction of non-indigenous animals and plants into the populations here, our plant populations, we begin to change the environment. If we look at that degradation further, and we look at it from the early 1800s to the Mexican era, to the gold rush that occurred in approximately 1850, a couple things begin to occur. A pandemic in 1833 impacts the indigenous populations, estimated of 20,000 lost in the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys alone. The pandemic spread to the America, Yuba, Feather, Tuolumne, and Merced River indigenous populations. Entire villages were lost, identified only by human remains. And in 1837, smallpox epidemics now impacts the area north and west of the Sacramento to the coast. So additional diseases, armed conflict, degraded food supplies lead to indigenous populations falling to approximately 245,000 to 150,000. Again, we're now removing that human interactive component that the indigenous populations provided. And then we look at the gold rush era to the early 20th century, saw the greatest change in the previous 12,000 years. We began continued forced removal and genocide of remaining indigenous populations. They now fall to about 15,500 survivors out of an estimated population of 300,000. And this essentially removes this human interactive component in our ecosystems. In 1824, widespread permanent grazing began. So now we begin the process of introducing cattle, goats, sheep. Heavy grazing occurs mainly in the Sacramento Valley and the coastal areas. Then we begin this commercial development exploitation process, mining, logging, grazing. And then we begin a process we call the Mediterranean agricultural conversion. That's where we come to California, which has this incredible native plant community that a large part of it has been driven by the indigenous population. And we want to change this into Italy. We want to change this into Greece. So we begin to convert this into what the Europeans knew back on their former home continent. In the drought of 1863-64, initiates the grazing of the Sierra Nevada. And this lasts for several decades. And if you consider that, about 100 years ago, half of the Sierra Nevada mountain range was classified as grazing grounds. So our historical cultural forest, even as little as 100 years ago, was still predominantly grass and herbaceous. Then we begin this massive slaughter of wildlife for agricultural, food, and productions, and simply for perverse reasoning or reasonings that are unfathomable to me. As an example, if you had grapes that you were growing for wine production, they would take water fountains, fill them with cyanide to kill off the native birds. They simply shot down the deer and the elk in the whole slaughter because they simply came in and ate the hay or the grain that was growing. Millions of animals died at the hand of the conversion of Mediterranean agricultural conversion. So in 1890s, the loss of native wildlife is so extreme that we actually began the process of conservation movements now begin. If we come to the 20th century to the present day, in 1910, due to the great burns in Idaho and Montana, as a nation, we declared the war on fire. With the removal of the anthropogenic fire that used to occur here, the natural fire regime is now disrupted. So we go in and we remove the indigenous burning over the process of approximately 150 years, and then we declare war on fire, and now we have disrupted the natural fire regimes, and then we begin to implement logging, development, and conversion of lands to support our increasing populations. We begin the process of legislation, policies, and perceptions. And more recently, we begin subdividing these lands, real estate, and now we have what we call the wildland urban interface problem. And then marijuana cultivation is now entered into the landscape where we have what we call timber conversion, where you can literally cut down 3 acres of timber for the purposes of cultivation, or convert that land out of timber into simple real estate. So what's the end result of this? So now what we have over this 200-year period approximately, we have natural vegetation responding to unnatural conditions. That is, conditions it did not adapt or grow with. And so this leads to unnatural plant association and with potential for extreme natural generation of extreme fire behavior. So in this photo here, for example, this is a ponderosa pine stand that was killed in the pine beetle epidemic. But if you look beneath it, before it died to that, you'll see the growing of incense cedars. So the pines are the subclimax, the incense cedars are climax species. And the whole purpose of this forest that is greatly out of balance is simply to be wiped out by fire to start over. Fire is nature's way of course correction. So we in truth do not know what a natural Sierra Nevada mountain range looks like. Humans have been affecting the plant communities for nearly 12,000 years. Some folks say 10, some folks say 12,000 years, but for millennia. So we look at some brief snapshots. Indigenous people use burning and plant management alterations. European contact introduced invasive species and changed indigenous cultural practices. The Western migration, in large strokes, introduced agriculture and commercial exploitation. Modern era, we're looking at fire suppression, population and conflicting policies. So this belief that humans have no responsibility to a plant community, at the same time this plant community in large developed with humans. So when I say extreme fire behavior is not caused by climate change, understand climate change or climate events can only affect fire behavior to the extreme level if the vegetations are in excessive numbers or a natural association. So, so these excessive natural fuels in numbers in association, they spread to our anthropogenic fuels, our homes, our structures, our junk. So what climate change does, it actually leaves our fuels or the forest vulnerable to fires for a longer period of time. Fire season now, for example, today, compared to where I started in the late 1970s, is about 45 days longer in comparison. But when you look at the fuels here, these fuels began growing long before climate change ever entered into the public or political discussion. So we have to look backwards and say, it's not climate change that is driving our fire behavior. It's really the fuels you allow to accumulate, and climate change brings this ability for a longer period and at times intense wind events or higher temperatures or more importantly, lower humidities that drive that. But if the fuels were not in such great accumulation and a natural association, we wouldn't have such extreme fire events. So we look at fuel environment versus climate change. So these are both modern day forests. One is set up for a standard replacement in extreme fire behavior, top photo, and you can see the amount of dead and down material and very little plant diversity. This is predominantly a mixed conifer forest of predominantly white fir and ponderosa pine. So one is set up for that standard replacement event. One is being managed by a low-intensity fire, the bottom photo, Mount Howell again. One is resilient to fire, forest pests and pathogens, and climate events, and one is not. Now, here's what I realize. Both photos were taken within a day of one another. So again, you can see both are modern-day forests. One is a managed forest, a tended forest that is cared for. One is a forest that has basically fallen into a state of neglect. So let's understand a little bit about fire-adaptive ecosystems. So the first thing we got to understand about where we live in the West Slope of Sierra Nevada Mountain Range is predominantly a fire-adaptive ecosystem. And we're looking about from 5,000 feet in elevation on down, just as a point of reference. So what used to happen was we had fire return intervals, or FRI. Simply put, how often a fire burns across the landscape. The natural FRI is lightning. And then the anthropogenic FRI, of course, was indigenous people in the history, going back in time, and then currently land management, accidental fire starts, etc. Again, this is introduced fire. This is a fire return interval. About every 3 years, fire is being used on Mount Howell to manage that property. So when we look at a fire-adaptive environment, understand a great deal of our native vegetation here co-evolved with or adapted to fire over a 12,000-year period. So the typical fire return interval was about 3 to 11 years, with an average of 7 on the West Slope of Sierra Nevada Mountain Range from about 5,000 feet on down. The natural fire was lightning, and again, the anthropogenic fire, the tool of these people, was utilized. The FRIs would vary greatly. For an example, if indigenous folks were maintaining black oak stands for acorn harvesting, they would have an annual fire return interval. If they were managing berry patches, for example, on the North Coast, the berries will have a fire return interval on some of the berry patches every 7 years. So the indigenous anthropogenic fire return interval would vary greatly. The indigenous folks were brilliant. They even had pest management strategies. For example, if you had a mosquito population you didn't much care for, they would burn the vegetation that the mosquito was located in. So the FRIs would vary greatly if there was an indigenous population in the area. So if you look at the FRI, a 10-year FRI would be 10 fires in a century, or 100 fires in a 1,000-year period, or 1,000 fires in 10,000 years on average on a 10-year FRI. Or if you go as frequent as a 3-year FRI, we're talking 3,300 fires in 10,000 years. Our current FRI is 50 to 200 years. So that's 50 to 200 years that fuels are allowed to build up before we get a fire in there, and most of those fires are unplanned events or accidental fire starts. So consider this: indigenous native plants, I know it's one and the same, develop or adjust to their environment through fire and non-fire adaptive traits. Now, these traits have a wide range of variety. They range from beneficial association with fire to fire avoidance. They also possess unique characteristics such as allelopathic that prevents the germination and survival of other plants, ensuring their survival from fire passage. So we have plants from trees to shrubs out there as example that want fire, and then we have shrubs in the case of whiteleaf manzanita. Again, it's allelopathic, and its way of avoiding fire is to literally sterilize the ground around the base of the bush, so fire cannot reach its real thin bark because it is non-fire tolerant. So when we look at that as an example of a fire tolerant species or fire adaptive species, we're into ponderosa pine and black oaks, with examples of using their long and loose leaf structure to have fire pass underneath these trees to eliminate competition of other trees and shrubs. So general classifications of these plants range from fire adaptive, fire tolerant, fire dependent, fire following, fire regenerative, so on and so forth. And depending on its growth cycle, it can move from a state of being non-fire tolerant to fire tolerant. A good example is incense cedar, as the bark grows thicker and the tree grows taller. So the removal of fire from a fire adaptive environment has resulted in a mixture of plant associations with this wide-ranging traits in unnatural numbers that these plants exist in. The results of this combined with non-native invasive grasses and shrubs is hot destructive fires. So in summary, we have removed fire, we've removed human interaction in an environment that wanted both and adapted to both, and then we introduce non-native plants and shrubs into this environment, and we have this great mixture of fuels, what I refer as fuels, of this vegetation in great number that didn't exist before. This leads to our extreme fire behavior. So you look at fire adaptability and fire tolerance, they're closely related. A principal component of the leaf structure that falls to the forest floor is the ability to spread fire. So long and loose needles, and if you look at this photo, this is ponderosa pine and black oak leaves. Again, the purpose of that leaf structure is to support the spread of wildfire. On the right photo, you see Douglas fir needles and incense cedar. Again, they like to avoid fire in just a kind of a broad general sense. So when you look at your plants out there and your trees, if it's short needle and small leaf, it doesn't want fire. If it's long needle, loose leaf, it generally wants fire. And again, this is what fire is spread in. We also call those fuels, we call those carrier fuels. Those are the fuels that carry the fire. So you look at this photo, it says benefits of low intensity fire, cold flow burning. The fire is spreading in the ponderosa pine needle and the black oak leaf litter. The purpose of this leaf litter is literally to spread fire to eliminate competition. In that process, it recycles the nutrients. It reduces the fuels. It eliminates the carrier fire that wildfire is spread in. For example, 90% of all wildfires spread in a dead branch, wood, and leaf that's 1 inch in diameter and less. That's why CalFire and the other fire agencies want you to rake up your dry, dead leaves. As this fire burns through this in the case this forest borer, it kills forest pests, it provides disturbance, it generates biochar, and they produce light smoke. Now, generally, most beneficial fire, low intensity, would occur in late fall, early winter. But again, depending on the indigenous practice, it can vary. But for most purposes, this is one of the more favorable fire spread because this occurs after plants have dispersed their seeds and gone dormant. So, in this fuel, titled Fuel Buildup and Unnatural Plant Association. So, while black oaks are adapted to fire and benefit from fire, the bark thickness increases with age, and that protects it. That inside, that the folium, the cambium, the xylem inside protects the inner tree from damage. This picture shows black oak associated with whiteleaf manzanita, which is non-fire adaptive. So if natural or anthropogenic fire was allowed to occur, these leaves would have killed these young manzanita plants long before they posed the current threat. So this is unnatural plant association in a fire adaptive environment. This manzanita should not be under this black oak. So why does native brush burn so hot? So native brush generates a lot of dead branch wood, and this is the principal reason it burns so aggressively. Most native brushes, by about the age of year 20, begin to tip over and produce a lot of dead branch wood. About 80% in some cases of native brush is actually dead branch wood material, and this is why it burns so aggressively. So in this case, whiteleaf manzanita, what it does is non-fire tolerant, but as it builds up this dead branch wood, this fuel mass, fire burns through, kills the current plant community, and literally cracks the seed casings and now regenerates the manzanita again. We have a term in fire service and wildland firefighting is the fuel, is the weather, or is the topography talking to you? So this example of brush talking to you, it's talking to you saying, the purpose I now exist is simply to burn. Again, we cannot alter the traits of this vegetation. It's natural. This is what it adapted to. This is what it wants. It wants and needs fire. So in this photo, cedars are cedars. Conifers produce tremendous amounts of seeds. We're talking ponderosa pine, incense cedars, white firs, Doug firs, so on and so forth. So as a purpose of this, in the past, fires or natural predations, so say squirrels, would have wiped out many of the seeds from the seed bank and would have killed many of the seedlings. As an example, one ponderosa pine was observed to produce 345,000 seeds per acre. So the purpose of conifers to produce so many seeds is the likelihood that from the point of seed casting to the point of germination and tree survival was quite low historically. So fire was a way of thinning out the forest, but the trees adapted to the point to say, I'm just going to put so many seeds out there, the likely probability that I'll have offspring will survive will increase. With removal of fire and removal of mechanical removal, we now have what we call this overstocking the forest. So now our forests are literally loaded with thousands and thousands of trees, actually billions of trees that should not be there had the natural processes worked as they adapted to. So in this case, incense cedar, again, it's largely non-fire tolerant, especially in this young age, burns quite aggressively. And people who maintain the forest in this structure are going to literally lose their forest to fire eventually. So when we talk about an explosive fuel mixture, native plants now have the potential for fire behavior for extreme. So in this case, we have unnaturally associated and overgrown, and they will rapidly introduce fire into the crown of these trees. In this case, ponderosa pine and canyon live oak. This results in explosive fire behavior, generating millions of firebrands. And this results in damaged soils, loss of habitat, damaged watersheds, loss of carbon. And also note, there's virtually no plant diversity, and it's really compromises biodiversity. So in this photo, you look here, you have Wesley ceanothus and Wesley manzita, ponderosa pine, and canyon live oak. That's predominantly what this site is, with just a little mixture of some herbaceous. So very limited in plant diversity, but loaded quite heavily with very flammable and destructive fuels. So consider this. Crown fire requires ground fire. Crown fire, or fire traveling to the canopy of trees, requires significant amounts of ground fuels to transfer that heat into the ground. So in this case, this open force is maintained by prescribed fire and has eliminated the ladder fuels and the ground fuels. Crown fire is literally not possible here. There's not enough fuel here. Even in red flag burn conditions, we call them, a fire would simply burn across this forest floor with ease, obviously, but the trees will survive, fire resiliency, and the canopies will survive. So even in the worst fire conditions that we have seen, let's say in the last 4 to 5 years, the winter events, this forest will survive a red flag event, and the fire will be predominantly along the forest floor. 1 or 2 trees will be lost for various reasons, but again, fire resilient. This is much how our forest used to look like. This is what the pioneers came into. This is why they described it as a forest that you could ride a horse through or drive a wagon through, and you didn't need roads. This is what, again, a representation of our historical or our cultural force. Consider this: fire adaptive forests need fire. So there's been a war on fire for 110 years. Ironically, we're losing this war. The lack of recurring low-intensity fire with fire return intervals has led to massive fuel accumulations. So when we had this mixture of fire adaptive and non-fire adaptive, and fire is a natural process of cycling these fuels and keeping them thin, that every year that we do not do something, that you do not do something in the forest that you may own, was 1/10 of an acre, or if it's 200 acres, fuels will increase a minimum of 2 to 6% every year. So the fuels every year load up unless there's some mechanism to reduce and remove those fuels. Again, we want to note the incense cedars here, which are climax species and non-fire adaptive. So this forest was on a correction course already to have what we call a standard replacement event fire occur in it. But then the pine beetles came along and they killed off the pine trees. So now we really have a really extreme fire problem represented here. So now we have plenty of pine needles, plenty of dead branchwood with dead trees, with non-fire adaptive, non-fire tolerant species. This forest is set up for what we call a standard replacement event of extreme fire behavior. So let's look at the human interactive and adaptive component here. This is where it addresses us as a society, as a people, where we are today, where we are a native plant enthusiast. So much of our native plant is arguably human interactive, it is adaptive, and arguably it is even human dependent. Again, going back to the Alma Musta travel ban, fire was given to them by the Creator as a stewardship tool. So fire maintained a large part of our ecosystem in a subclimax in the desired state. This was most productive to meet the indigenous folks' cultural needs, food, medicine, tools, etc. The desired state provided great diversity in the plant community, therefore great diversity in life on all of the life forms. Indigenous folks also used weeding. They cut and removed. They did gardening, what we call now today. And they actually introduced plants into areas. As an example, the field break project I'm currently working on, we have an area that we're Valley oaks were entered into a particular canyon and a small riparian meadow stream where we know these valley oaks were brought in by indigenous people. And again, that's assisted migration. Many of the plant communities are human dependent. An example, black oaks are a great example. If not cared for, as Dr. Anderson tended to, conifer encroachment will come into black oaks and will eventually grow up and shade them out, killing the black oaks. So black oaks actually require human interaction, human intervention, if you will. So if you consider the indigenous folks were arguably probably one of the most botanically advanced cultures in the world. An example, in Grass Valley, Colfax area, we have nearly 800 native plants. And the indigenous folks had a working knowledge of the plants, from either direct use, such as food, to indirect use, such as if we work within the plant community and, for example, burn, we generate deer brush, which is great feed for deer. So we want to increase the deer population. There were certain plant strategies they had. So consider this, the wilderness, or the concept of wilderness, is actually a Western cultural construct that has been placed on a human interactive adaptive ecosystem. You know, the old saying, take only memories and footprints and you know, leave your memories. Indeed, indigenous people practice what we call true stewardship. Ironically, from an indigenous perspective, we let the mountains go wild. Wilderness is not a good thing. So our views, our constructs is keep the humans out of the forest, keep the humans out of the ecosystem is a good thing, is actually in this case not. And again, a wilderness or let a place go wild results in less productive ecosystems. So if we look at the human, so let's look at this photo here. Human interactive, adaptive, and arguably dependent continue. So if we look at the concept of letting it go wild or let it become a wilderness, and you put on there other social and political results, what do we have now? We have devastating wildfires. We have decreased wildlife populations. We have less water. We have reduced our native plant populations. We've reduced the biodiversity. We have increased forest pests and pathogens. We have slowly degraded and damaged our soils. We've decreased carbon sequestration or carbon capture. We've increased carbon emissions. We've compromised this climate change adaptability resiliency. We reduced and increased numbers of threatened and endangered species. We have caused the extinction of others. This is the result of a wilderness. This is the result of letting it go wild. If you think about it, we have very effectively and efficiently severely altered and compromised the biological adaptation in a little over 2 centuries, and it accelerated 50 years. So our wilderness concepts are actually causing mass collapse of a lot of our ecosystems and extinction of species. Again, and getting nothing that we desire from our plant communities as a society or as folks that are passionate about our native plants. So again, historical forests were cultural forests. They're generated by indigenous folks. So here's an example. Tree stalking, historically, now this number has a wide range, but just as a good generalization, tree stalking was typically 25 to 70 trees per acre, with an average of 40 per acre. Forests were open with herbaceous understory less than 100 years ago. Half Sierra Nevada mountain range, again, was considered grazing grounds, and nutrient cycling occurred at a much higher rate by fire, and there was significantly less competition for nutrients, water, and sunlight. We increased water yield, and it was highly productive with great biodiversity. In this photo, you look here, this is probably approximately 1910, 1920, based upon the clothing the two folks were in the photo. And you can see what the forest looked like approximately 100 years ago in great parts. Again, that classic designated as open grazing grounds 100 years ago. Again, a good example of at that point, a surviving historical cultural forest. Again, a modern day forest properly managed, but again, you can see the herbaceous component here under this particular ponderosa pine stand here. Again, just another example. So where are we today? So our modern forests today are in this kind of state. So we use that 40 tree per acre average, and that will range on the size of trees. For example, you have very large mature trees, you may have as few as 10 trees per acre. And if you have a very young forest that's growing, you may have as many as 150 trees per acre. And that's all depending on the age of the forest. But if we look at things in a general context where we're at, our forest now, from that 40 tree on average per acre average, we're now 500 to 1,000 trees per acre. That's what these forests represent here. It's basically in a perpetual state of stress. The competition for nutrients and water and sunlight are great. The nutrients are locked up on the forest floor. That is, there's no cycling or recycling regime such as fire. They're highly prone to disease and insect attack. They have significantly decreased water yield. That is how much water comes out of the forest. And they're highly prone to extreme fire behavior. So again, if you look at this upper photo here, that's about 1,000 trees per acre. And the lower forest, there's about 500 trees per acre. So these forests exist in very unhealthy, unnatural states. And when we have climate events such as a strong north wind, high temperatures, low humidities, things of that nature, these forests are very vulnerable to extreme fire behavior. So one thing we need to look at is drought adaptive. Now, this drought adaptive ability of our plants also drives our fire behavior. So, for example, in the photo here is an example of our native moss and ferns. So, consider this. Droughts are naturally reoccurring events. We have a drought every year. We call it summer. It lasts 3 to 7 months. All right, with hot temperatures hot temperatures, no rain, low humidities, and wind. Drought traits can be divided basically in 3 categories: desiccation tolerance, total dry up. In this case, this photo, this is a rock lettuce or cane dead leaf. But look at the moss behind it; it is already dried up. That's its drought tolerance strategy. I'm just going to dry up and ride it out until we get some moisture coming in. Then we have drought avoidance, such as plants that change the structure. You know, stomata open at night, day, but they open at night to let carbon dioxide in, and to slow the rate of evapotranspiration. In other words, to lessen the water needs. And then we look at early leaf drops, such as our buckeyes or with our blue oaks. These are the drought avoidance strategies. And then annuals. We have the greatest amount of annuals in any place on the planet, the Golden Hills of California. And these dry up to ride it out to the next event, next winter or next rain events. So the drought adaptive strategies of our plants is why they occupy in our annual drought called summer. So if you look at drought adaptive continued, then we have drought tolerant, which is just an all-around catchphrase for dry plants. So in our drought, when we look at our plant community, it has all these different drought adaptive strategies. And a good example is the common adaptations you'll find in the leaf structures, particularly of a lot of our shrubs or brush. A good example, again, is Manthea or Canyon live oak, and it has this waxy leaf structure. Now, next day in the woods, look at the leaf structure. It's waxy, like a sulfane wrapper, much like we used to keep a sandwich from drying out. So are the structures of these leaves. And they have deep root systems, they have rotating leaves, they have all these drought adaptive characteristics. But here's the bottom line. Drought adaptive plants, the very nature of the drought adaptive characteristics allows them to burn quite aggressively, and they're highly flammable. So going back to the plant's traits, we can't change the native plant community. It is adapted to fire, and it's adapted to humans, and it is adapted to drought, and we can't change those traits. We can't legislate that. We can't write policies about that. That's our reality. So here's a great example. This is California buckeye. It's a drought-avoidant species with the adaptive trait of shedding or losing its leaves as the summer months progress. It is also one of the first species to leaf out early in spring when the moisture levels are higher. As example, this photo is taken in mid-July. While appearing quite dry and vulnerable to fire, it does not burn aggressively. Compared to other native vegetation species, it has significant ecological values. So we talk about holistic fuels management. So in the fuel break where this buckeye is located, when we encounter these buckeye trees, we leave them. We clean them up a little bit, but we leave them because what they do from a fire performance perspective, don't burn that aggressively, but ecologically have a lot of value. And if you look under the buckeye tree, not a lot of vegetation growth because it leaves out early, provides that shade, hence shaded fuel break, and that shade suppresses the growth of other vegetation. That's why we like shaded fuel breaks. So the next thing we need to cover quickly here is climate change adaptive. So we look at climate change adaptive. So we have climate change breaks into two broad categories: anthropogenic climate change, generally greenhouse gases, and the theory is driven by predominantly in today's discussions carbon dioxide being commonly perceived to focus upon. But we have natural climate change events, and this is changes in solar activity and results such as volcanoes. Climate change has been around for millions of years. It's nothing new to us. And here's the good news. We know that this forest ecosystem is or was climate change adaptive and resilient, based on the fact that we have the same plant communities now that existed when we had climate change events in the past. So this is actually good news regarding climate change. So consider this: in the last 1,000 years, we've been through 3 significant climate change events. From approximately 900 AD to 1300 AD, the Sierra Nevada mega drought period, also known as the European medieval warming period. Present-day Don Lake was 35 feet lower than it is today. And there's actually stumps in modern-day Donner Lake down to 35 feet where the old shoreline was. From 1300 AD to 1850 AD, or the start of the gold rush, was called the Little Ice Age, colder and drier with multiple events of alpine glaciers as they retreated. So think this: the Sierra Nevada literally translates in Spanish to snow-covered mountains. It got the name snow-covered mountains way before 1850, during the Little Ice Age. It got that name during the summer months, not during the winter. No one would be impressed with snow-covered mountains in the winter. Think about that. And then think about our present climate change event. From 1850 to present, we entered into a warmer, wetter period. And now we have the present climate change event. So history will tell us whether it's just an extension of the warmer, wetter period, or whether it's a whole new climate change event occurring. So here's the bottom line: the historical forest had fewer trees and was much more open and survived on less amounts of water. Plants adapted and moved up down the Sierra mountain range as temperatures changed. So the historical forests were climate change, climate event adaptive. This is a photo of Nevada City, California, 1850. What I want to draw your attention to is the background, the mountain in background. Look how open and shrub cover or brush cover it is. Look at the forest at the base of that mountain, how open it is. Look how few trees there were. This was a historical forest. You would not recognize this in modern-day Nevada City today at all. So that's kind of a good representation of what the gold miners came into and what they encountered. So we look at climate change adaptability. It's been severely compromised in the historical forest structure. The most recent event was the western pine beetle epidemic that came to Sierra Nevada mountain range. Basically, mountain stands upon of pine were severely compromised both by a lack of water and competition, and the water gave way to basically a beetle buffet. The overstocking of trees results in trees being in perpetual stress. So when you have too many trees on an acre, trees can sense one another, and they compete for sunlight, water, nutrients, and they'll actually slow their growth rate. And they need to be released so that they can grow. But they exist in stress. And so the natural biological response in a forest system is to eliminate trees that are under stress, and the pine beetles enter into the fray, and they do their job. They attack the stressed trees. And the drought we came through here a few years ago brought on additional stress to the trees. So when trees are stressed or overpopulated, they live in perpetual stress. They're attacked by the pine beetles, and the pine beetles are part of the ecosystem here. The unnatural overstocking in trees due to the prolific seed production and due to the removal of fire or removal of those seedlings by mechanical means results in this perfect combination when you add in droughts, warm, dry winters, climate change events, opens up the forest for attack. So here's a little culprit here. This is a western pine beetle. So in a healthy forest, where the trees have access to water, it takes about 2,000 beetles to kill a healthy tree. And a drought-stressed tree can succumb to only 24 beetles. That's why this epidemic was so severe in our ponderosa pines. And one mating pair can have 12 million. And then those beetle populations don't begin to decline for 3 to 5 years post. So we're just coming out of the last pine beetle epidemic. We just came through another dry winter, or where this next winter is really going to set us up. We have another dry winter. We're going to see the pine beetle epidemic probably pick back up again. Again, western pine beetle gives you an idea of the size of the little guy. And this is a result of when we do not manage or interact with the forest ecosystems. Again, this is a result of ponderosa pine. This is going to be down around Mariposa County, and where they had horrific loss to their ponderosa pine forest stands. Again, a photo we've already seen. Again, pine beetle epidemic. So what's the result? The result is that overstocked, unhealthy forests have literally tons and tons of fuel available for a wildfire. You look at this photo here. This is a pine beetle attacked pine stand that collapsed within 1 year of being attacked, and result is the accumulation of tremendous amounts of fuel now available for a wildfire. So it brings us to our next concept, is disturbance. So disturbance in biology is a temporary change in the environment, conditions that cause pronounced changes in the ecosystem. Disturbance usually acts quickly to alter the plant community or the structure of the arrangement of the biotic or abiotic communities. In other words, disturbance is when, whether it is brought in by nature or by us, it's a change in that community. The Sierra Nevada mountain range adapted to, a large part of it did, I should say, adapted to wanting and needing disturbance. Fire was a disturbance tool, as an example. In this case, in this photo, we are creating disturbance by removing, in this case, tremendous amount of manzanita brush, and this disturbance is going to open up the ground for pioneer species to come on in, or herbaceous plant community to recolonize into that. So this is disturbance by mechanical means. Again, disturbance is either biotic or abiotic. So biotic is living, again, insects, animal, pathogens, humans, which we have the greatest capacity for disturbance. Then abiotic disturbance, non-living, fires, wind, snow, landslides, floods, etc. So disturbance, going back to that human interaction component, what the indigenous people did and what we can do is now provide a healthy disturbance. So much of this plant ecosystem is disturbance dependent and arguably relies on disturbance. Principal disturbance tool was fire in its day. At the same time, the indigenous folks, they dug for geophytes. Those are bulbs in the ground. A good example of geophytes are modern day onion or garlic. They would dig for geophytes. Coppicing, or cutting back to the base. A good example is the indigenous folks would cut, locally would cut a redbud back to the base to make basket-free shoots. And then pruning to maintain plants in more of a desired state. And they literally weed it. They literally garden in riparian meadows, meaning by the water, wet meadows. They would go in and pull out the conifer encroachment because the meadows were too wet to burn. And so they literally removed plant species. In the photo here, you can see a great example of what we call the carrier fuels. That's that 1 in 10 hour fuel. And as the fire burns through, it generates biochar. It recycles the nutrients of the walked up vegetation. But as you can see, the young Doug fir is going to be killed by the fire. That reduces the competition. This is, in this case, a control burn where fire is being used as a disturbance tool to recycle nutrients and eliminate competition. So fuels management, going to kind of the hardest thing about holistic fuels management, excuse me, fuels management, it is disturbance. And so fuels management is termed by agencies, land management agencies, to change or reduce the amount of accumulation. Is a fuels management crew. In this case, we are releasing, in this case, we're doing a release of conifer and oak woodlands. When we use the term release, what we're talking about is reducing the amount of vegetation, both the number of trees and shrubs, so there's less competition. And that releasing allows the remaining trees and shrubs to grow much more aggressively. They have access to more sunlight, more water, more nutrients, and it pulls that stress off. So in this case, the brush is predominantly being removed in whiteleaf manzanita. So again, this is disturbance by a fuels management crew. This will release this forest to grow more rapidly, which will in turn capture more carbon to fight climate change. So disturbance by mechanical methods can be very simple. It can be simply if you have 1/10 of an acre under a California black oak and you have a bunch of young conifers growing under that black oak, simply cutting out those young conifers, in this case incense cedar, will help protect that oak from both fire. It will help begin to reduce the competition. But importantly, it will keep that fuel bed from growing, that when a fire does burn through, it won't kill the oak. Now, black oaks are fascinating species. They live up to 500 years of age. They are the #1 food provider in the West Slope of Sierra Nevada mountain range, both in acorns and in the foliage. So when you're managing your own personal landscapes, look at the trees and say, how can I interact and how can I benefit, in this case, this black oak? So again, this is disturbance by mechanical methods. Again, another example of, in this case, low and slow fire utilized for black oak management. In this case, fire is a disturbance tool. So again, when they use fire, in this case, in this photo, it is being used to reduce competition, cycle the nutrients, and eliminate a forest pest that I'll introduce to you here in a little while. So it was disturbance that is repetitively introduced by indigenous people that form the desired state. Again, another picture of a restored ecological forest. This is out of Auburn, California. And you can see the native bunch grasses are returning into this open ponderosa pine oak woodland forest. Disturbance was principally, again, by fire, combined with the natural environment, the Mediterranean environment, that enhanced the fire adaptability, which in turn enhances both the drought and climate change adaptabilities. So you kind of see the whole cycle occurring here. As we introduce fire, disturbance, human interaction, the Mediterranean climate, drought adaptive, we begin to alter or change this plant community, or if you will, in our case, we're trying to reestablish it, recreate it, or regenerate it, would be a more accurate term. So here's the good news, where we're at in modern day, in 2020, amongst this pandemic. The Sierra Nevada ecosystem still retains its highly adaptive and resilient traits. Those have not been lost. It is still human adaptive, arguably dependent upon us humans. It is still disturbance adaptive. It is still fire adaptive. When plants are in historical numbers in association, good news, it is fire resilient. It is resilient to climate events and forest pests and pests. It is drought adaptive resilient, and it is climate change adaptive resilient. So we now have at our hands a ecosystem that wants us to respond, that wants us to interact with it, and it still retains all these great traits. And so we have literally this toolbox, right in front of us that we can take advantage of to prepare our forest for the future. So this kind of leads to the heart of what many of you are interested. So what is a fuel break? How can I interact on my lands? What advice can I seek? What can I do with my 1/10 of an acre? What can I do in around my home to protect my home, but yes, protect my native plant at the same time? So we're going to discuss what is a fuel break. So what a fuel break is, it's a fire behavior modification tool. If you want to look at it from a fire control perspective or protecting a community, it changes fire intensity. It changes the rate of spread, that is how fast the fire burns across the landscape. A large fuel break will literally absorb fire, well, not even large, any fuel break will absorb fire brands, those are burning embers that enter into it, and it will absorb them, and it will reduce the amount of fire brands exiting out of it. It reduces spot fires. Spot fires are small fires caused by fire brands or fire embers landing on flammable vegetation, and it converts or changes crown fire, that is fire running through the crown of trees, to ground fire. So what is a fuel break? A fuel break is simply a fire behavior modification tool. Fuel breaks are not fire breaks. Oftentimes folks get these terms confused. So a fire break is an area that has nothing combustible. A fire break does not burn. A fuel break is still combustible. A fire will still cross across a fuel break. In this picture, the road is a fire break. In this picture, the road is a fire break within a fuel break. So as you can see, we have modified the force structure here so that low intensity fire can burn through the fuel break, but the road is the actual fire break. So in this particular fuel break, this is called a strategic fuel break, and which means we thought about where we're placing it. We know the fire history, we know the fire behavior, we know where the fire will likely start given the history, what we refer to as fire history, and the strategy behind it is to have road structure within the fuel break that can rapidly allow firefighters ingress into the fuel break to control the fire. But again, the base point here is recognize a fuel break from a fire break. All fuel breaks work as designed. You'll hear folks say, well, they did a fuel break around my town and didn't work, or I did a fuel break and the fire burned right through it. Please recognize that if a fuel break doesn't work, it was not properly implemented, it was not large enough, or lacked accessory programs such as pre-attack plans, evacuation plans, fire-wise communities. In most cases when fuel breaks fail to do as designed, it's mainly on structural losses is because of lack of defensible space. So fuel breaks, and I got to emphasize this very much here, fuel breaks will not protect your home from a fire. Fuel breaks will not protect a community by themselves. Fuel breaks must work in conjunction with defensible space to save homes, as an example. So defensible space, the focus on your defensible space should be what we call the home ignition zone. That is the structure itself in 0 to 5 feet out as a minimum and up to 30 feet under state law. So while a fuel break may allow a fire to be controlled for entering the community, bear in mind, fire brands can travel up to 1/2 of a mile, still igniting the structure and the flammable items adjacent to the structure. So you can build a fuel break around the community, and as a fire enters the fuel break, the fire may be controlled at the fuel break, but the ember cast going downwind still may and will likely ignite structures if they don't have defensible space. This is what happened on the coast. This is what happened in Town and Paradise. Even where fuel breaks were successful in modifying fire behavior, it was the ember cast downwind that the structures lacked defensible space and why many were lost, unfortunately, along with human lives. And we don't want to see that tragedy ever repeated again. So fuel breaks, bear in mind, they vary greatly in size. Examples are the fuel reduction zone. That's what CalFire refers to as when you do your defensible space, from the edge of your structure out 30 feet is non-combustible, and then 30 to 100 feet is that fuel reduction zone. So that is a fuel break. Roadside clearance is another example of fuel break. That may be allow for the ingress and egress of firefighters and civilians. That's a fuel break. Roadside clearance. Tactical fuel breaks. That's where you may have the ability to take that town's, if you will, baseball park and connect it to the town's river, and that intermediate strip of vegetation may be a small tactical fuel break to tie those two fire breaks together. And strategic fuel breaks. That's large. These are what we call large-scale fire behavior modification tools, and they help protect community infrastructures and help protect the natural resource. So, as example, we call them splats, which are strategically placed landscape area treatments. So in this case, this is the North Fork American River Shaded Fuel Break. This is the project that I'm currently managing. And it's located both to protect the community of Colfax, but it's also to protect the North Fork River drainage system itself. Landscape treatments are generally of 1,000 acres in size and greater. Advance to another photo here. So this is the North Fork project. In the foreground, what appears to be a clear cut actually is not. That is actually a series of riparian meadows that has been undergone great ecological degradation through about a century and a half of abuse. All that scarring you see on landscape, that's from the motorcycle, off-road vehicles. We've hauled 50 yards of garbage out of there and trash. And we're in the process working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to restore those riparian meadows in there. Botanically, they're just incredibly beautiful. So in this case, we're anchoring into this montane meadow structure and working to the south. And so if you look the screen right, you're going to see some smoke, and I hope you can see my little arrow up in here. The fuel break extends way back into these forest systems back in here. And this has all been treated in here. And that's what a well-maintained fuel break, managed fuel break, you won't see a big change in a lot of the forest structure. But again, I just wanted to give you folks, and again, this is the North Fork American River. The fuel break protects the river drainage system, and the fuel break, screen right, protects the community of Colfax. So fuel break implementation needs to address basic concepts such as reducing fire behavior. You want to be able to generate fire resiliency. You want to generate climate change resiliency. You want to generate forest and pathogen resiliency. You want to generate plant diversity to help increase overall biodiversity. You want to increase and maintain carbon capturing to fight climate change, and you want to provide ecological restoration to native plants. So again, this is a treated area here on the photo here. And what you see is, in this case, these are blue oaks with gray pines and redbuds. Notice we did not cut and remove all the shrubs. In this case, the redbuds particularly. Redbuds, other than being a beautiful plant, they're a non-fire performer. That is, they don't burn very aggressively, but again, they have great ecological benefits. They're nitrogen fixing to the ground. They're a beautiful living species for pollinators. And again, also the seed pods are edible by insects. So again, a fuel break should have many facets to it that you're trying to restore. So you look at performance-based holistic skills management, or ecological forestry, you're actually restoring the human interactive component. It's going to be varying age, varying species. We're going to look at the fire performance of the plant communities or the individual plants on site. We're going to look at the ecological performance. We're going to look at resiliency enhancement. How can we make sure that fire passes through, that the plant community remains? And we're going to look at ecological restoration, and it's going to be site-specific. In other words, as we enter onto the different sites, as the vegetation, slope, aspect, topography changes, the plant community will change, and then we'll adapt our treatment techniques accordingly. So when we look backwards to generate forest ecosystems for the future, so we look at the historical cultural forest as a proven template to meet the challenges of the future. So good fuels management is actually good restoration, and we're looking backwards, utilizing those examples that allow the ecosystem to go forward and be adaptive to all the events that we're trying to manage, from fire to climate change. It can be said the forest has an incredible memory. It just has to be reminded. if you will, we're that memory tool that we hope to remind it how to respond. So you think about this, going back to in cultural force or indigenous people. So one of the things that we employ is indigenous management practices in the application of traditional ecological knowledge. So think about it, we now have the responsibility to reestablish the human interactive component with the remaining descendants of the first people, the indigenous populations. Human interaction between plants is natural. Again, as you apply IMP and TEK, these interactions, indigenous management practice, traditional ecological knowledge, they generate great biodiversity. Small efforts can have big results. And that's why, you know, going back to people that may own that 1/10 of an acre of native plants, that 1/10 of an acre could have great biodiversity benefits by managing that landscape with their native plants. As an example, that 1/10 of an acre, and as you increase your native plant populations in there and you manage it properly, may be simply a seed bank and dispersal for the native birds to take the seeds and transplant those seeds out to the greater environment. So one of the tools that we utilize is fire mimicry. So in utilizing fire mimicry, we let the dominant vegetation, the site, and the knowledge of the site say, if fire was allowed to burn across this landscape, what would be here? So in this case, we look at the fire traits, and we look at what we have as a mixed conifer oak woodland forest that would have wanted fire, and therefore all this, in this case, wedge-leaf ceanothus and white-leaf manzanita would not be here if fire regimes were allowed, or the fire return interval was allowed to burn across the landscape. And we also know that these sites were indigenously occupied, which would have had greater fire return intervals. So we use fire mimicry, that is, we're trying to recreate what fire would have done through mechanical means. And here is a result in the fuel break. This is using fire mimicry. We look at the site and we said, had fire burned through here, what would it look like? It would have been a much more open, patchy forest. At the same time, on the bottom screen, you will see we do retain shrubs. And we retain these shrubs for, again, that ecological performance. And shrubs may provide nesting habitat or simply the flowering benefits to the native pollinating insects there. So again, using fire mimicry as kind of one of our guiding tools. When you look at performance-based holistic decisions in fuel treatment, we have things we refer to as treatment guidelines or specifications. And as you go through that, we look at the site. And the site can vary in size and area just to a few feet, a 10 by 10 patch, and the site can be specific to acres upon acres of the vegetation. So we break performance, I break performance into basically two categories: how the vegetation burns, or regardless of it's fire adaptive, non-fire adaptive, and what does it provide to the environment. So other determining factors on retention of vegetation are what's the benefits of wildlife, the maximum size of the tree, and other things are further delineated. And then success of implementation varies upon the project managers and folks supervising work. So in this photo left, these are manzitas that we retained in the fuel break because, well, they're magnificent species and specimens. And so what we did is we simply separated the fuels out so that if fire passes through, these manzitas will survive. Then we further put around the base of the manzitas by pulling back anything that may burn about 2 feet so that the bark, as thin as it is, will not be killed by fire. So you can have shrubs and brush on your property, but you have to maintain them. You have to interact with them. Again, here is a site that was heavily populated by manzita and buckbrush. And this site, using fire mimicry as our guiding tool, this wants to be a combination of blue, black, and canyon live oak, and some Samota white oak in here, with predominantly gray pines and ponderosa pines. And using the leaf structure and what was here, what would have been herbaceously, we removed the vast majority of shrubs and brush. So we have a fire resilient landscape and we have a very open forest. And the net result is this part of the field break is going to be managed to maintain that overall dominant tree species in there and protect them from the loss of fire. And let me give you a good example here about climate change. So if this forest had no human interaction and had a fire burn across this landscape, 100% of these trees would have died. Now, trees, for example, compared to shrubs or brush, shrubs can only hold about 10% of the carbon capturing that trees can. So again, what we want to do is protect our carbon capture, our sequestration, and we want to enhance and increase our carbon capture abilities, and that's what protecting these trees do from fire, plus all the advantages that we also get from trees. So we talk about varying age, varying species. Forest ecosystems are not normally monotypic, so we select small trees for removal, we thin from below, and retain the large trees. The biggest challenge that I see occurring out there is people cutting down their big trees thinking it's a big threat to fire. Your big trees are your least threat to fire. It's your small trees. We want to retain our large trees. You're going to hear terms such as ecological thinning. That is where you thin the forest and you want varying age of trees, age, and varying species, different species of trees, to build in that resiliency. We want it to be open, and we want to pat and patchy. And we want to retain shrubs and or brush. We want to generate a complex structure which allows for the generation of native herbaceous plants and grasses, while making a fuel break that protects human life, property, infrastructure, and things of that nature. And then we look at ecological performance. We talk about snag management. While emphasizing how living vegetation performs ecologically, we also want to look at logs and snags and how they perform ecologically in providing wildlife habitat. Again, we're striving for complexity in the plant community, and dead vegetation creates habitat for a wide range of wildlife. In this case, in this photo, the shorter snag left is actually for a bat, is bat habitat. And the larger snag, which is a Dougford killed by an earlier fire from 2001, the bats again will get in those large chunks of bark that are being sloughed off, is bat habitat. And then of course these snags serve as perches for birds of prey, for the raptors. So here we got a combination of snags for both bats and for birds. When we do fuels management and restoration, we make the pathway for the reintroduction of native herbaceous plants. Again, now that we have a fire resilient landscape that is fire can pass through it with minimal loss to the tree structure, we can now look at the natural colonization or introduction of herbaceous native plants into what was before a massively overgrown forested ecosystem. So, same photo, we thin from below, we remove the ladder fuels, and again, no herbaceous plants, photo left, photo right, now has the ability to begin colonization of native herbaceous plants into there. When we do fuels work, or when you do fuels work on your property, you want to separate and thin. You want to break up the fuel continuity. This both significantly reduces the fire potential and increases the likelihood of plant survival. So again, if you look at this photo, we have varying age, varying species. We have anything from gray pines to blue oaks to manzanas. We have log structure. We have all this in place so the fire is going to burn through the fuel break. It's going to lessen its intensity, but we're keeping the complexity of the forest ecosystem intact so that we get all the benefits that we want while ensuring that the vast majority of the trees and shrubs will survive fire passage while reducing fire intensity and protecting our communities. When we go out there, again, our goal is to create, in a general sense, park-like environments. We want open forest and we want patchy. We want to create a landscape where we have great diversity in our native plant community, and that great diversity in our native plant community leads to that overall biodiversity. So again, we're looking at how it performs, how fire-wise, fire performance. We're also looking at ecological performance. Again, picture right shows a reestablishment of a nice herbaceous understory, and you can see the native irises are coming in. They're actually quite prolific at the site, along with the yellow star tulips. I often get asked, can I maintain native vegetation for privacy screens? I don't want to see my neighbors. I don't want to see my road. So this particular residence is using whiteleaf manzanita as a privacy screen, but what you notice underneath, photo right, there is no dead branchwood, and it is clean underneath. This whiteleaf manzanita is now inert regarding fire behavior. It literally cannot burn. There's nothing to carry fire into the bush, into the crowns of the bushes and the leaves. And in this case, this is a privacy screen of native shrubs, but notice they're being tended to, they're being cared for. The dead branchwood is being removed, and the underneath is kept clean. Because remember, whiteleaf manzanita does not like fire, so the accumulation of leaves, branches, needles, etc., upon fire passage will actually kill these shrubs. In this case, the manzanita. So again, note there's no ground fuel. These manzanas are maintained with no branch deadwood, and they are allelopathic. That is, these particular shrubs, manzanita, whiteleaf here, reduce a biochemical into the ground that prevents the germination and growth of herbaceous plants. So we're using this native plant and its allelopathic properties in fuels management to maintain a privacy screen. At the same time, this is the application of indigenous management practices or traditional ecological knowledge. This is how the Indians would maintain the manzanita plants to harvest the berries to make manzanita cider and harvest the berries later on to get manzanita sugar. But again, the plants were tended to. They were not simply let to grow wild. Again, application of traditional ecological knowledge. And then prescribed fire. After we do our initial fuels treatment, we now have the opportunity to reintroduce fire back into the ecosystem, and because we have many native plants that are what we call fire following or fire regenerative. And without fire, they simply do not grow or do not become prolific. So in this case, after our initial treatments, we're allowed to bring prescribed fire back in and reestablish those fire return intervals in the natural fire role. Here's a great example. So miner's lettuce. In this case, it's a fire follower. It has a long-lived seeds in the soil. It's a prolific seed producer or prolific seeder, makes lots of seeds. It does mass flowering in years following a fire, but begins to diminish years 2 and 3, and has rapid growth upon fire passage. The Indians would burn routinely to generate miner's lettuce as a food source. Again, application of traditional ecological knowledge. The advantage of miner's lettuce, if you don't consume it yourself personally, is meadowlarks and doves love to see. So here's a plant that is fire following that we had it back in our forest system would actually increase our native bird populations in regards to doves and meadowlarks anyhow. So I talked about this guy early on, and I promise you we're getting close to the end. This is the filbert weevil. It's a forest pest that infects acorns. It lives in the oak leaf of the forest, particularly in the black oaks. And the indigenous management practice, the removal of the leaves by fire, really breaks up the habitat for this forest pest. Now, the Indians would burn under the oaks to recycle the nutrients and get rid of leaves to destroy this habitat. The Indians actually burned, they had pest management strategies where they applied fire. Now, here's what's really important to us in modern day. The filbert weevil and the filbert worm can infect up to 85 to 90% of acorn crop production. That destroys both their food value and their seed value. And when you consider what this means, that the acorns, which are a huge food source for our wildlife, is only about 15 to 10% now available. And this now affects all our acorns and all species of oaks here on the west slope. So you look at acorns as a necessity for wildlife. Oaks and the acorns are important. They have fats and proteins. They provide browse wildlife, and they provide all manners of benefits to primary benefactors, folks that eat the acorns, and then animals that prey upon those animals. So black oak trees and stanza trees create predator corridors as an example. Black oaks provide habitat for protected and endangered species. So this is an acorn woodpecker here in what we call a granary tree, and he's literally storing up the acorns for winter. But again, the filbert weevil, the filbert worm that lives in that oak leaves, those leaves need to be removed from your oak trees for fire safety reasons, but also to enhance acorn production for the wildlife. Again, if you go out there and you look at your acorns, you start seeing a small hole. This is the force pest, the filbert weevil, the filbert worm. The other thing we want to do very quickly, generate forest resiliency. Human interactions result in healthy, resilient forests. We increase our biodiversity. We clean air. We clean water. And we provide more water because we have less competition for that water. We then reestablish the native plant herbaceous understory. Much of the native plant serves as water infiltration, grows mycorrhizal hyphae, builds the soils, and these green native bunch grasses actually slow the rate of fire spread because the plant material is green, which resists burning from fire. Provides us forage for wildlife. So the reestablishment of our native herbaceous understories, both from a native plant enthusiast perspective, is very important, but when you look at the biodiversity and complexity it offers is also very important. In this photo, again, here is a forest, a privately owned forest of about 10 acres, where this gentleman has restored his native plant community in the form of bunch grasses that just literally seeded back in. This is early spring. In this photo, you begin to understand why in 1863-64, the same drought, because it's the same state that impacted Sacramento Valley, they drove livestock up into these mountains because the grasses were green in the same drought. This is, again, why that 63-64 drought caused all that livestock animals to come up in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, because the grasses were green even in a drought. Again, we look at it as a fire behavior modification tool. This again, to recap, plant diversity generates biodiversity. The more plant diversity, the more wildlife we have. When you look at your lands, ask how can you increase your plant diversity, and how can you in turn increase or help that overall biodiversity out there, or the things that rely on those plants. And for folks out there that are wondering, well, I live in an apartment and I have a balcony, I put a little comment in here. Even if you plant a California native milkweed, let me be specific on that, that will benefit our monarch butterflies. So even have one or two native pollinating plants on your balcony, if that's all you can do, you're doing something. You're doing a positive step in the right direction. And here's the big one for us. When we look at restoring our ecological performance and our forest resiliency, we're actually looking at restoring our soils. So herbaceous plant materials break down and more rapidly. They help build our soils. For every 10 pounds of organic material, can generate 1 pound organic matter. So from a fire control perspective, if we can increase our organic matter by 1% per acre, that acre will hold 20,000 gallons more of water. And then that means our vegetation stays wetter or greener longer, which is resistant to fire spread. We generate root exudates, and those root exudates in turn wind up feeding soil biology. We can capture tons and tons of carbon into our soils if our soils are healthy. So, in summation, which one of these forests will support life is fire resilient. The photo on the left, the photo right. Again, both photos taken the same day. There is no changing the photos here. The photo right, hot destructive fire. The photo left, again, serving its purpose in what we want in resilient forest landscapes. So recognize this. We as a society are going to spend billions of dollars in fire suppression. We either invest in ecological infrastructure repair or rebuild our homes and infrastructure. We spend money on ecological restoration, or we watch it burn. We clean air or water, or we have polluted air or water. We sequester carbon through healthy forests or watch our forests become carbon emitters through fire and through collapse. We let fire play out its natural role, or we have hot destructive fires. We increase biodiversity, or we watch other species become endangered or potentially even extinct. We're always down to the world of two choices, unfortunately. So just bear in mind this, nature is neutral. While we debate, pontificate, otherwise procrastinate, nature has all its tools for self-correction. They're already in play. And it will reset itself by literally wiping out the landscape. It does not care about our beliefs or policy or politics. It burns all things equally, businesses, structures, and life. Just remember, nature is neutral. It doesn't care about what we think. This is what our choice comes down to. Same forest. We can either live with, think that we're going to survive the overstocking forest, high fire danger, or we can get in and become interactive. Just bear in mind this, we're the only species that can perceive the environment in its entirety, and we have probably the greatest obligation on the planet from our perspective. And just that, wildfire is the only preventable natural disaster. So that is my conclusion, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen at this point. And I hope you folks are still awake out there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. That was terrific.
That was really.
If you all have questions, please type them up in chat and send them in. I've sent in a couple already. I'll ask my question. Is there a manual of any kind that a neophyte could get their hands on to assess and then act on their property?
Well, one of the best things out there is called the Fire Effects Information System, FEIS. And that's an online site that you go to look at that. When you look at, if you turn to, there's no specific manuals. It's more about increasing through our local chapters what we call fire adaptive, non-fire adaptive. There are many books you can read out there on fire adaptive traits, but the first step is really looking at your forest in this, your plant community, is what is there. Recognize all our shrubs, one fire and will burn and be copaceous by fire. So there's not one specific book, one specific manual, and there's talk about trying to generate that kind of literature. So let me look at the questions here.
I have a question. How do you do this land clearance? Are you doing chipping? Are you doing burning? Or what techniques are you using?
Our predominant tool is chainsaws, and we're chipping in the summer months and we're burning in the winter months. And our big goal is to actually move the vegetation. And so the problem with chipping that we encounter is, as you chip the biomass, you got to make sure that we don't wind up loading at the base of trees or loading it into herbaceous areas. So, so we're using all the tools in the box. We're using chippers, chainsaws, broadcast burning, pile burning, and in some places we've used mastication as an entry tool. But then in mastication, we have to go in behind the mastication and clean up the mastication. So mastication is a brush mower. And so we use that as an entry tool.
And
does that help you, Ben?
Who pays for all this? How does that work?
So so this was the 45-day report, 35 projects. So a lot of this money comes from the Greenhouse Gas Initiative dollars. So those CPI dollars, Climate Change Initiative dollars, is what's cycling back in. With other funding sources may vary anywhere from fuels management dollars allocated to CalFire, the department. We can get dollars, for example, U.S. Forest Service has some fuels management dollars that they can expense in time. So they provided it over to us. So varying funding sources. All right, Ben, gotcha. So looking at the questions here. So differences, so I got, do we retain chaparral when trees are encroaching in shrublands? So I got a question for Stephen here. It says, do we retain chaparral when trees are encroaching shrublands? Well, it all depends what you're managing too. And what I mean by that is if you want to maintain shrublands, recognize shrublands or brush-covered slopes, eventually they're going to burn. One of the realities is we're always going to have fire come across the landscape. We always have the saying, it's not if a fire occurs, it's when a fire occurs. So if you're looking at that, at a predominantly shrub or brush-covered slope, you need to get in there and put some kind of breaking into that fuel continuity. And that could be simply going there and breaking down the continuity by putting strips in there or thinning it out. Excuse me. And as far as trees overshadowing, I think that's what Stephen's referring to. Excuse me, trees overshadowing the shrubs. If you have a few shrubs or a few trees in there, your shrubs are going to be okay. So I got one from Kathleen here. It says, how can Native people possibly cover so many thousand acres of land? It seems impossible. So, so the way they carried so many thousands of acres is fire will spread over thousands of acres. And so when fire occurred on the landscape, indigenous people, bear in mind, let's go back to that historical cultural force. Fire wasn't a threat. So when a fire left a planned burn site, if you will, to use our modern terminology, they didn't really care if it burned further on beyond the planned burn site. Bear in mind, you also had natural fire return intervals that occurred. So to answer your question, if you go and, for example, and look at Kat Anderson's book or Blackburn, Dr. Blackburn or Dr. Bonson, and you look at the early explorers and the missionaries and the pioneers in California, they talked about Indian fires sweeping across thousands upon thousands of acres of native vegetation. They talked about how they would try to go up the coastal mountain range, but literally the landscape was blackened in all directions and provided no feed for their horses. That's how much fire would go across this landscape. So in generating the native plant communities and to maintain the open forest that they wanted, and one thing to maintain also about fire was used as an animal husbandry tool. So if one technique that was utilized quite common by the Indians was to burn off the native brown grasses in early summer in the valley and along the stream and rivers along with riparian zones. That's the only place that would remain green, and that would force all the wildlife to come into those riparian zones. So the indigenous people would not go hunt abroad out in the grasslands. They would burn off the grasslands to cause the wildlife to come to the rivers and streams where they were within arrow shot or an ambush shot. So again, they would both use fire as a tool locally, but when that fire went beyond their local sites and then come out of natural fire, and then you had this whole thing we call mosaicing of fire across this landscape routinely. So I'm trying to go through here. How do you prevent the oak acorn weevil again? If you simply remove the dead leaves and branchwood from underneath the oaks, that is the habitat. This oak acorn weevil, it cycles from the oak leaves on the forest floor, and then in turn claws, climbs up the tree and infects the acorn seed, then drops to the forest floor. So you break up the cycle by removing the leaves. The indigenous managed as it was fire, but obviously fire is more challenging for some folks, so just rake them up and dispose of them. I got from Karen Walden, mastication still leaves a large amount of fuel and prescribed fire reduces the fuel. Yes. So in mastication, all we're doing is literally mowing the brush and changing the structure of the fuel type into basically wood chunks. And yes, you do have to have a removal process for mastication to be an effective fire resiliency tool. The minute we change the structure of the brush, we have an effective fire behavior reduction tool that is in its intensity, but we haven't generated our fire resiliency. So mastication is what I call a nice entry tool. From Deborah Ayers, she says, the Dorado Chapter worked on with Fish and Wildlife on creating a field break in chaparral to the perimeter of Pine Hill. They use chainsaws and pile burning, reduction fuel plus. So yeah, so you can't with a chaparral. And then I have from Stephen, everyone fired after trace fossil recorded predating human arrival on continent arrival. So yeah, fire has been part of this landscape. Natural fire intervals is before humans even arrived on this landscape. Okay, in digging in soils and past failure, we rarely find any signs of char ash. If there was so many fires, why isn't there evidence in the soil? So bear in mind, a lot of the char and ash that would have occurred in the soils has between a 50 to 1,000 year, it's called biochar, a retention of soils. So a lot of that fire would have burned, they'll put it this way, when fire burns across the landscape and the fuels are dry that will carry fire, you only have about a 7% retention of biochar, that is black charcoal. 93% of it converts to white ash in hot, dry fire. So you have a very little charcoal left in hot fire regimes. And bear in mind, when fire would have burned across that landscape, there would have been comparatively not a lot of vegetation to generate that biochar. And then biochar breaks down by both biotic and abiotic means as it enters back into both into the atmosphere. So that char, that biochar, and also has to do with the density of the wood. Manzanita is very dense. That biochar can last much longer compared to softwoods like pine. So pine wood biochar is very soft and breaks down quite rapidly. So for that biochar to get integrated into the soils, there had to be some kind of disturbance mechanism to get it into the soils. And by the time it probably entered, it was probably broken down so much by nature that it's probably a fine dust, and that way you won't find large chunks of charcoal because it had to get worked into the soils by some methodology. From Kit Birdcamp, we're asking Alice's question, in removing leaves and detritus, what is the effect on mushrooms? Don't they thrive on? Yes. So bear in mind, when you're looking at mushrooms, they do need the leaf and needle structure for them to grow in. So that's all part of that management strategy. So that goes back to not every acre burned every time. So you can have those mushrooms out there. Bear in mind, fire, the way fire would cross the landscape, a fire may have started by either humans or by natural. In early as June, it may simply back down to a stream and went out because back then our streams were not choked with Himalayan blackberry. So a fire that may have backed into a stream 1 year may cause another fire to spread the following year. So this becomes a very complex and patchy ecosystem out there. So going back to your fire safety, yeah, you can maintain that. So what are you striving for? What are you managing your plant community towards? That's the big question. And so as you have your native plant community, and most of all have some of that, the question is, what are you managing towards? So that's why we talk about management and stewardship. I don't know if that helps, but I hope it didn't hurt. Can toyon be left in clumps? Limit up if you can. So toyon, yes, toyon, when you work with the toyon bushes, what you want to leave is 4 or 5 main stems, and that will actually suppress the growth of smaller stems. So I have, how do we learn to do a control burn on our own property? We have too much pine needles and oak leaves and poison oak to rake up. Thank you. Yeah, I think we all have that problem. So as far as learning how to do a control burn, I can give you some there are things formed out there called PBAs, Prescribed Burn Associations. And what these PBAs are trying to do is inform those through the UC Davis extension programs. And in short, what they're trying to do is give people the basic tools on how to learn how to do a control burn. So if you've never worked with fire before, you can look for PBAs. They offer presentations. Now, COVID-19 currently has their presentations shut down. When you do control burns, wherever you're located, be sure to meet with your local fire agency. In most of California and the wildlands, it's going to be CalFire. as there may be certain regulation permits you may need to obtain, and the size of the burn may require additional permits from Air Resources Control Board, for example. Here's what you got to remain about any controlled burn, any fire you may like. He or she who lights the fire is responsible for the fire and has a liability for the fire. So if you don't know what you're doing, do not strike a match to it. That's kind of how that reality. So, but if you are going to burn pine needles and oak leaves on your property, again, I suggest risk versus gain models. And what I mean by that, it is better for you to burn those pine needles and oak leaves in the winter months when the probability of a controlled escape is very low. And again, always take precautions of putting in a fire control line, a fire break down to mineral soil, have water on site, and you must have what I call adult supervision. And that means a person who can make reasonable, intelligent decisions. Aren't oak leaves the fertilizer organic matter for the next season? Isn't it necessary for soil health? Again, from Kit Camp. So bear in mind, many of our oak leaves are the fertilizer for organic matter for next season. Oak leaves will break down in time, but Western forests are adapted to fire as a principal tool of nutrient cycling, that is breaking down that material. Because our Western forests enter into our dry summer months routinely, most of our organic material does not naturally decompose. That's why we get a fuel accumulation on our forest floors of logs, leaves, and needles. The rate of decomposition is quite slow compared to, say, eastern forests or forests that have more water. They simply dry out, and the rate of decomposition slows significantly. So I have, should grasses be mowed? Here's the sort of quick answer. Grasses should be mowed for fire season when they can support the rapid spread of fire. And as far as mowing those grasses, again, a couple words of precaution. Do it in the early morning hours. Do it with a non-metal blade, aka a weed eater, a string weed eater. Nylon weed eater is best. And when you're working with herbaceous plants and removing them, as much as you can personally, let them go to seed. But when you're looking at a fire safety issue, then you kind of got to balance fire safety out against those grasses. And a general rule of thumb is if the grasses are less than 6 inches, generally they're not a fire threat. But bear in mind, grass stub 1 inch tall will spread fire just fine. You want to change that intensity. I got, would you help me please, from Becky Hudak, would you please help me understand a 30-foot defensible space? What exactly is allowed in this space? So the 30-foot defensible space is from the edge of a structure and 30 feet out. And what that defensible space means is there's nothing where fire can burn across the surface of that 30 feet. That is the ground. So within that defensible space, we have what we call lean, green, and non-combustible. That can be, if you will, concrete, rock, a green manicured lawn, dirt. But within that 30-foot defensible space, you can have trees, you can have shrubs. They can be native, they can be non-native. So what you want to look at is, can a fire transition from 30 feet out and literally burn right up to your home? That's what that defensible space is. So what you want to do, if you want trees, you want to separate the crowns. If you're maintaining shrubs, you want to separate the bushes. You don't want what we call fuel continuity. That is the continuous fuel from the structure out to the wildlands. So I hope that helps you, Becky. From Stephen, off-season prescribed burns versus burns that occur during fire season. Are there differences in the trajectory of these communities? I don't know if I understand your question there, Steve. Are there differences in the trajectory of these communities? So off-season prescribed burns versus burns that occur during fire season. A prescribed fire, I mean, this may help. A prescribed fire is any fire where we have a prescription and we're trying to meet an objective in that prescription. Now, that prescription might be the removal of fuels. That prescription may be the increasing the enhancement for the generation of native plants. For example, we want to do nutrient cycling. That prescription may be, we want, example, in the presentation, we want to generate miner's lettuce. So in that prescription is, why are we putting fire on the ground? What intensity of fire do we want to have? What do we want the fire to spread in? There's no such thing as off-season or on-season prescribed fire. You can have prescribed fire any time of the year that the native vegetation will carry and support fire. So what is the objective of the fire that you put on the ground? And the time of season may, a good example, if we're targeting star thistle, an invasive species, we may be doing prescribed fire in June and July when the plant is at its flowering stage, and typically takes about 3 applications of fire to eradicate by fire star thistle. So that would be an example of that kind of prescription. I hope that helps a little bit, Stephen. Yes, again, from Chrissy Freeman, UC Cooperative Extension also offers classes on prescribed fires online these days, she says. So to find out more, go to email. So she has SD Culture at University. No, you'll see it right there on the chats there, folks. So you can go there. So Kit Vernicamp, current standards now recommend no vegetation within 5 feet of structure. So that 5 feet of structure is called a home ignition zone. That's 0 to 5 feet out. That's nothing flammable out there. So when Kit refers to no vegetation within 5 feet, the actual recommendation is nothing flammable 0 to 5 feet out. That could be a cardboard box. That could be a dried stump you brought back from the ocean that you're putting your plants in. So nothing combustible 0 to 5 feet out. If you go to NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, look up home ignition zone, and then also if you another fascinating is look up ember intrusion test, NFPA, on YouTube, and that shows you how embers spread to a structure. So ember is called an ember intrusion test. Recording for webinar series that hosted, let me read here. So Kit has put up some information regarding burning from UCCE. Thanks for doing that, Kit. Okay, Gene Wilson has posted, you can grow native bulbs in rock gardens next to your home. They're gone by fire season and you don't have flammable material next to your house. Again, a good plant strategy. Do you think some trees can actually protect a house from embers? Absolutely. On many, many wildfires, I was with CalFire for nearly 37 years. And it's very common to see ember casts come to the crown of trees, and actually the ember cast is broken up. They kind of fall straight down. So they can help in protection, but bear in mind, the size of the ember can literally still break up and come on down to the tree canopy. So I have seen that occur. So they can help. And I think that's all I have for questions so far. I hope I got everybody.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was just an awesome presentation, and look how many people stayed right to the end. Lots of great questions, good answers. We really, really appreciate your time, and what a great eye-opener on lots of different things. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It
You
was a
bet,
great
Deborah.
talk.
I appreciate that.
Chris, that was terrific.
No, thank you very much.
That really was. Still got people on here.
Will a recording be available?
There are several recordings that will be available. The one that was on sent live stream on YouTube, you can always follow that link that was in the invitation and go to that presentation there. And the Redbud Chapter also saved it on Zoom, and the Dorado Chapter saved it on Zoom. So
Thank you.
it'll be available on a bunch of places.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Well, thank you.
Let's see who we still got here. I don't want to shut the meeting down if people are still on
I never go till the party's gone.
here. It's dwindling down. 13.
It's thinning out.
Yeah. 12. Chris, you must be kind of tired at this point.
Well, you know, I'm here for you folks. So when it's over, it's over.
I posted the link to the green blog at UC for the Fire Prevention Association.
Okay.
And everybody, you can save that chat. Use the 3 dots to the right of it. You can save it on your computer.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Hey, Chris, this is Dan.
Hey, Dan.
Can you address how to manage Scotch broom? I have it on my meadow.
Okay, the best way to go after Scotch broom is you got to pull it out by the roots.
Okay.
The problem with broom, it produces a lot of seeds, about 8,000 seeds per plant, and those seeds can live in the soils for 25 years. So in pulling it out, you probably get the seeds to reestablish. You can use herbicide, though I'm not a big fan of herbicides personally on broom. So what I would do, if you cut it, it goes right back. It's a basil sprouter, right?
Yeah.
So if you cut it, make it go back. You got to pull it out by the roots, and then you just got to stay on top of it. We had great success with eliminating French broom, a cousin of Scotch broom, on Mount Howe. And what we did is we pulled it out by the roots mechanically. Best time to do it is in the winter months. And then what we used was prescribed fire in its second year, just as it flowered, to break up seed production. And we found that each we did that successfully. We had 90% reduction in plant regeneration. So pull it out by the roots. Best to go out there in the wetter winter, spring months. It comes out much easier. And then once you get the big plants out, stay on top of it. The problem with the broom species are they are toxic to wildlife, and they are monotypic, and they deplete water rapidly in a meadow, and then they literally take over the entire meadow, you realize.
So after you pull out the big plants in the winter, you'd probably want to burn them.
You want to burn them on site. Do not transport them. That's why broom is spreading throughout our counties, because people are transporting it without covering it, and the seeds are being dispersed via pickup trucks to the roadsides. So yeah, so burn it on site. And if you can, burn it from where you pulled it. You actually might want to kill some of the seed generation right there. Does that help you, Daniel?
Oh, that's great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
You bet, sir.
The other thing I've heard is good is if you're not able to do a burn, to go back next year and weed whack when the little plants are coming up before they've had a chance to set seed. And
yes, Captain.
that'll help eradicate it too.
Yeah, Daniel, if you hit the plants when they're small little guys and they're about the size of grass that's say maybe 8 inches tall, they have not yet established a significant taproot to survive. So Kathy's recommend is outstanding. Yes, you hit it hard with the weed eater, you will kill a lot of that seed germination. The big thing you're after is disrupting the flower seed cycle to exhaust that seed bank. That's what you're after.
Okay. I pull thousands of them a year anyways, by hand.
No.
But that's hard work.
Well, it's hard work, and you met Himalayan blackberry, you probably have a full-time job.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, two of the nastiest species introduced to this continent.
I hear
but
you.
Kathy's recommendation, small plants, weed eater, generally will get it before that taproot gets established.
Okay. Thank you.
Before they set seed. Got to do it before they set seed.
Absolutely.
Anybody else out there want to ask another question? No? Maybe we better end this then. Oh, I look foolish. Let's see. Alice, what do you think? And Jean, should we call it a day? Is Alice still there? I think Alice.
He also did.
Jean is here. Jean, you want to call it? Hello, Jean.
Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Okay.
Night.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Okay, thanks.
You bet, Kathy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.